All right, welcome back to the In My Beach Boys Room podcast. I am Adam Schreiner here with Matthew Hartz. And today we're going to talk about Dennis Wilson. We're going to take a little break from the history, at least the timeline.
Yeah, the condensed history.
Yeah, the condensed history. Yeah, obviously, we'll be talking about Dennis's history a little more in depth. But
we'll try not to be too redundant when we've already talked about some of the stuff, but some of it will have to be in there for reference.
And we're doing this now because this is in the area where he passes.
Well, yes, he passed away in 1983, and I think that we felt like this was a good spot to do it. But we're going to pick up on the condensed history after this Dennis episode. We'll pick up on a little bit of what happened with the Beach Boys before he passed away, and then go on from there. So that's the plan, everybody.
Awesome. Okay, and so just real quick before we get into the social media stuff, that was Forever that you played. And
with my buddy Nat, who's visiting from, actually he's originally from San Diego, and he's out in North Carolina now going to music school, and he was here visiting for a little bit, so we utilized his talent.
Yeah, whenever we have a good musician, we gotta throw him on the Beach Boys podcast somehow. So thank you, Nat, for he's off to the side here. Thank you for helping us with Forever. That was a really nice little, and hey, the little funk in the towards the or in the middle there, is that like the solo normally on the song, or did you add that in yourself?
No, that's the Dennis wrote that part. Those chord changes are really kind of different for that middle section, and they lend themselves to a little funkiness or punkiness, however you want to interpret it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was cool. Kind of when you're like, now the funk, and I was like, oh, that's fun there. Okay, so anyway, the social media stuff, you can find Matthew Hartz music on YouTube or MatthewHartz.com as well. Matthew Hartz has a Twitter that we are not active on at all, but if you are on Twitter, Matthew_Hartz, Instagram, Matthew Hartz Music, and then Facebook.com/Matthew Hartz, or
just Matthew Hartz. It's got the picture of me and my brother. I'm holding a banjo.
And so if you want to follow the social media, most active, just really on YouTube, and then the podcast.
Facebook is where that's the thing I'm most literate on, and when I do post the stuff, it's usually on there. And I think you've done a little bit on Instagram, which I got some feedback from some people over the past couple of weeks, and they would like for us, because they're not on Facebook.
Yeah,
to do the gram
stuff. We're the worst at the social media stuff, but we'll be better. We'll be better for you. Okay, so that's all our social media, housekeeping business. I think at this point, Matthew, I'll let you take it away, and I'll interrupt when I have questions or want to comment on, because Dennis is kind of the wild card of the group, wouldn't you say?
Well, there is a little bit of wild card in there. He's born in 1944. He came 2 years after Brian and 2 years before Carl. So he was the middle child, and he exhibits a lot of that middle child syndrome stuff as he's growing up. And before we get into too much of it, what I was thinking about earlier is he's probably the most organic of a very organic story. Really, for Dennis to blossom into what he became from where he started versus the others, you know what I mean? It really is quite a story, So, pretty neat. Yeah, good observation. When he was in the neighborhood when he was young, I don't think Dennis would have been a kid I would have liked to have met.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
With some of the best stuff. There's a documentary that's based on John Stebbins' book about Dennis from, I think, the early 2000s or late 1990s. It's on the BBC, and it's called The Real Beach Boy. And David Marks is featured on that, talking about a lot of their childhood and growing up with Dennis and the kind of stuff that they pulled.
Yeah.
And he was known as Dennis the Menace in the neighborhood, and he wasn't somebody you necessarily wanted to run into, But he could be, there was that other side too. But he was kind of the tough kid on the block.
Well, and it's funny that you say that, because like some of the songs that he has written are like these beautiful, like Forever, for example. It's kind of a funny contrast, you know, a little dynamic there with some of the songs he's wrote, and him launching off of drum set stand to you know, like
well, yeah, I mean, he's definitely a tale of two cities in that respect, you know. Also, I wanted to mention a lot of the information that I really have gleaned on their early music history, the Wilson brothers, is from a lot of David Mark's interviews, and he was there, you know, I mean, and so were some of their other friends. When, you know, so a lot of people don't realize that Dennis learned some basic piano skills early on, especially from Audrey. Audrey famously, and it's from an interview with David, I've got, you know, taught them all how to play what they call the boogie woogie, you know, which is, you know, just kind of a boogie piano style with a certain pattern. And David claims that because she taught them all how to do that, including him, that they all had the same feel, you know, just from learning that. They knew they all had the same, whether they're playing guitars or anything like that, they all had this early feel that was based on Audrey showing them all that boogie woogie piano thing. And then there's another friend of Dennis's from school, and I think it's in that same documentary, and I can't remember, I can't remember the guy's exact name, but he talks about when Dennis was that age, he would watch him play the boogie woogie until his forearms would just like tense, you just like really intense. And I don't hear the story told that way a lot, that Dennis actually had some of that stuff going on before he picked up the drums, for instance, or a lot of people think he didn't start playing piano until Bruce Johnston started showing him more about it in the 60s, and then he started writing, right? But no, he was doing a little bit on the piano, and he was also doing some of the family singing along with Murray and Audrey and Brian and Carl, but he didn't participate as much.
Right,
you know what I mean? That's kind of the story. He was off doing his thing, you know?
Yeah. The only beach boy that actually surfed, right?
Right. And that's, you know, we go on, you know, when he got into his late teens, well, not his late teens, because when the Beach Boys started, he was literally about 16. So it had to be pretty early. When he literally embedded himself into the surfer lifestyle. I mean, he hung out with those guys. He wore a Pendleton shirt down on the cold beach and went surfing with those, you know, and so that's why he really was. It wasn't just oh, look at that, you guys should write a song about that. It was Dennis being in that, literally not just as a surfer, but living the life of a surfer, and then bringing that idea when, you know, they had Brian and Mike and Brian and Al and everybody had played together in different configurations, but it was while they were playing one weekend when Dennis famously came, you know what, you guys should write a song about surfing. That's the new kind of thing. And so, you know, really, the guy that was the wild card was really the initial spark.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy.
And then another funny thing, though, is when the Beach Boys got going, Dennis wasn't going to necessarily be part of the program. And Audrey kind of threw a fit. And she goes, you guys are going to include him, you know, and I mean, they're all so glad that they did. But he wasn't real serious about it. And it was hard to corral.
I was about to say, so that was more him than them? Like, it was more him, not necessarily...
Yeah. And I don't think that... I think it was hard for Brian to see just what kind of talent his brothers had at that age, too, and how dedicated they were going to be. Had no idea that a 14-year-old Carl and a 16-year-old Dennis were going to grow into the musicians they did and be able to write music themselves and support him the way they did. I mean, I'm sure that at that young age, he was, you know, just assessing what they could do at the moment.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. So then when did he actually start with the drums then? You know, he started, you're saying that the boogie woogie stuff was actually...
the piano stuff.
That was very, very beginning before he even picked up the drums.
Oh, yeah. He didn't pick up drumsticks until after, I think, the first single.
Oh.
They had it.
Oh, yeah, because you told me how they
Brian was the first drummer with
one
one finger on the first record, right? And Carl on guitar and Al on stand-up bass. That's the only instrumentation. And I don't think Dennis was really playing at that point. But then once they got with that, because he didn't play anything, he just by default, they just handed him the drumsticks. And what an amazing story this becomes at this point. He didn't turn into the world's greatest drummer. as there's some early advertisements for the Beach Boys where it's actually them on radio, where he says, "I'm Dennis, I'm the world's greatest drummer." It just in pure jest, you know, on the other guy. But he wasn't the world's greatest drummer, but what he was is just he had a great natural feel. And he's playing drums on most of the first few albums. It's not the session musicians yet, except for in a couple of instances. It's Dennis playing that perfect surf feel on that. And he was also hired by other people as early as 62 by Gary Usher to come and play drums on sessions for stuff that's been released. This is a guy that learned how to play the drums like 6 months before that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
He's
that's
going
wild.
in and laying down. They had no click tracks or anything like so, and they had to do everything live in one take. We've talked about that, right? Especially the earliest stuff. I mean, there's only one, you know, and he did all of that so well. And then not only did it well enough to be doing it with them, that other people were hiring him to do it for them.
Yeah, that's
a pretty crazy story.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even, you know, like you said, might not be the world's greatest drummer, but even like when you watch some of those clips, I mean, he's just a showman. Like your eyes are kind of drawn to.
They say he was all in.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
They say the chicks were in because he was just all in. You know, he had the head shake thing before the Beatles ever had it. You know what I mean? And kind of he was, which brings us to that next point of very early on, he became the sex symbol of the group, and they all talk about. Brian says, you know, I remember first time the girls rushed the stage and pushed us out of the way to get to Dennis.
Yeah,
you know, so. But his being the sex symbol definitely was an element of their early success.
Yeah, and
it propelled them early on. You know, it was, you know.
And so what that BBC interview that you had me watch, he's
so I had you watch that documentary.
Just a clip of it for like you're like make sure you watch this for as like kind of like homework before I can't remember what era.
Okay, gotcha. Okay,
but you had me watch it, and he's talking to I don't know, looks probably like a lady in her mid-20s, and he's like a young kid, and he's just like, I mean, yeah, like he's kind of the sex symbol, but I mean, he owns it. He is definitely like flirting with this lady that is
already, I think he's 18.
Yeah, you know, and like he's looking at her like, yeah, like, hey, I'm taking you home, lady. like you know, like it was just
normal thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that was that clip I was showing you. It's before a concert in 1964 and in Oklahoma, and she was a reporter that was it's out there on the internet now, and but yeah, I know what you're talking about. He compliments her on her dress.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, exacgly. I mean, it's almost like to him there's not even a camera. He's like there's a pretty lady right here.
Hey, I'm going to mention one of these books really quick because on page Dominic Priori, Beach Boy historian extraordinaire, one of my absolute favorites. This book came out in the early 90s. It was the first one to come out solely on Denny, and I ordered it when I was in college, and the author Ed Winston autographed it to me. It's mainly a picture book, but it does have some stuff in there. But there's a section that Dominic wrote for it, and it's titled "The Drummer with the Knack Was a Surfer."
Huh.
There you go.
Is that the first?
That's probably the first book on Dennis.
Just him?
Just Dennis, you know, but I got these out. I mean, just on Dennis, I mean, I don't know if I have everything, but I know I've got at least four books, one written by his adopted son, Scott, but there's four just completely on Dennis in my collection. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, and you like, all of them are well written. You like them all, how they're all.
Yeah, they all cover different territory, and we'll get into that, I guess, a little bit later. You know, he was also into cars. He was the only one. He raced cars in the early 60s.
Nice.
He had a Cobra and he was winning trophies.
Oh.
So at racetracks, and he had to do it under a pseudonym. Because they couldn't know that it was Dennis Wilson, you know, because of insurance reasons and all kinds of stuff. And so he did that.
And so he was doing this when he was already known as a Beach Boy?
Yes. And so here you have the guy, not only was he the surfer, he was also the only guy that was really a car guy, because he did all the work on his cars, his race cars and stuff too. And so think of the Beach Boys and what they were known for from 62 to 64, maybe even 5, primarily surfing cars. And he's really the only real deal in each one of those categories that they got, you know? And I was thinking about that this morning and thinking, man, huge deal.
Yeah.
He's a big, also Dennis's voice, people don't realize on the early stuff like 409 and Surfing Safari, actually those tunes, which were actually recorded at Western and taken to Capitol, and that's what they signed them on, but then they used those recordings for the actual releases, right? I think those are just some of them are just the Wilson brothers and Mike. Well, obviously, because David's not in there, and Brian swore that he'd never let David sing. So it's just the family singing on some of those early tunes. And Dennis, his voice is always pretty. I can always hear his voice in the harmony stack, you know. And he, for the guy that was considered at that point, especially the weakest singer, you know, Brian knew there was a special quality to his voice that definitely, you know, was something different and something to sell, because he also gets a lead vocal on the very first album.
Oh, really?
Little Girl, You're My Miss America. So, you know, I think it's cool because Brian had already recognized a certain quality in his voice that was going to be good for some lead vocals, and probably he sang lead on a lot of other tunes through those early years, and especially album cuts. But when we get to 1965, especially the Today album, he gets the lead on Do You Want to Dance?
Oh, nice.
That, you know, and that's one of my favorites.
I
mean, his vocal is so muscular and so gritty and so much. I mean, it would be way different with one of those other guys doing it. It wouldn't have near as much power. And then on the end of the Today album, he gets one of Brian's most progressive tunes. I mean, everybody says, oh, wow, this is a signpost to Pet Sounds, but it's a really lush ballad that's a hard jazz tune with a hard melody, and old Dennis gets called in to sing. Had no problem with it, you know. You know, so he's on the rockers, and he's also being used on the progressive music because Brian knows that his voice is unique and a good thing for them. You know? We've talked about how the Beach Boys are one of those amazing groups that all of their members have, you know, I think they've all, you know, sang on the hits.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Oh, you got to say during 65, Dennis was first married.
Oh, okay.
And all of the guys, with the exception of Carl, I think had gotten married at this point. But
young marriages, huh?
Yeah, and none of their management and the record companies didn't necessarily want people to know that they were married. Just like when the Beatles got married, they didn't want. So it was kind of a secret deal with a lot of them until later on into the 60s. But he had married a gal named Carol Friedman, who I'll go ahead and say something about her. She had a son already, but Dennis instantly adopted him and took him as his own, and always did throughout his life. This kid was no different from Dennis's real children. And I've always thought that's very admirable. He wrote this book called Son of a Beach Boy, and it has some crazy stories in it about his life and just what it was like to be the son of Dennis Wilson. There's some great stories in here you won't get any other place. This is a rather recent book. This is like 2015.
Oh, wow.
Scott is also the guy, he in construction, and he was in charge of building the Beach Boy Monument down in LA in Hawthorne. So that's pretty cool.
Nice.
But Dennis married Carol and had the family but he was never a very faithful husband. And Dennis was married 5 times total, 2 times to 1. But, you know, it was the rock star life, and there, you know, who knows how many relationships and all that other stuff. But 5 marriages is, you know, quite a bit. But each one of them were significant and affected his life in a very big way.
Sure.
You get after 65, when we get into Pet Sounds and Smile, Dennis especially, and Carl too, but you hear stories about Mike not being supportive of the new direction. And maybe but one of the things we know for sure is Dennis was steadfast in his support of the whole thing. He wasn't going to question anything that was being done. And I love the quote that he has about when he heard the track For God Only Knows the first time in the studio. He's just like going, they had started paying attention, but this was crazy. And it was like, he said, this is like your brother has a secret and he tells you about this magic secret that he's got through an art form. It's like that. 'Cause it's just, so he talks about the intensity of those moments of when Pet Sounds and Smile were being created, and how amazing he thought the music was, regardless of what everybody around. So the brothers always did have Brian's back.
Right.
I really do feel that way. Also, Dennis, he did some drumming. I think he's drumming on That's Not Me on Pet Sounds.
Okay.
Some of the drumming, and then he plays drums on some Smile sessions too, which is something most people think, oh, no way in hell. It's all Wrecking Crew stuff. No, there's those guys, Carl and Dennis were right there helping, and Carl being used a lot, but Dennis being used even too. Well, he wanted to play the organ on Good Vibrations, and so Brian taught him the part and let him do that, so that's on the released recording there too. I've always known that for a while, but the new Sound of Summer thing that came out on June 17th had some liners in there about Brian talking specifically about teaching Dennis that part, so more corroboration on that. In 66, when they were on tour while Brian was making Pet Sounds with a lot of the Wrecking Crew guys, that's when Bruce says that he really started to map the piano out and help Dennis learn more about the piano. It's not that he started him from scratch, is what some people think at this point. No, he already was playing a little bit, whether it was just the boogie woogie or not, I don't know. But that's the point when Dennis starts to figure that out with Bruce's help, but also from 3 or 4 years of just watching Brian in the studio and write songs. It's just, all of a sudden he starts writing some amazing music in the late 60s. The first things he writes are great and getting put on albums. And to your point about, the rough and tumble guy that he was, and saw, the very first things, there's Little Bird and Be Still on the Friends album. And they are two of the most mellow things in the, I mean, they're not music that you'd expect from Dennis Wilson, I guess,
surfing and driving cars and being the person that he is. Well, that sometimes that's how people are. If they're super revved up on one end of the spectrum, they also are super, if you on the emotional level, loving and soft on the on the other end of the spectrum. He
famously had a huge heart and helped anybody. Helped anybody. One of his wives, I think Barbara, the second one, she said, came home and found her washing machine and dryer gone, and he'd given it to somebody, and just that type of stuff. But that's also, since we're at the late 60s and when his writing starts, that's right in the time when, the nice guy that he is, he sees a couple of hot chicks on the side of the road and takes them home, and all of a sudden the Manson family's in his house for a while, right? Because he's so generous and not judgmental and open-minded, whatever it is, and certainly likes young girls.
Yeah.
And drugs at this point, which that's what all that offered up to him,
Yeah. Like you said, rock star lifestyle to the max.
Yeah. Yeah, and that whole deal, we covered that more than enough, but we've talked about how that forever really changed the calculus with Dennis. He I'm sure you would be. I mean, when all that stuff went down with Manson, I mean, he was forever a changed person after that. And the guilt and any of that was associated with it. But I'm glad that he was able to overcome it somehow, at least a little bit of it.
Yeah.
In the late 60s or the early, I'm not sure if they started late 60s or the early 70s, but Daryl Dragon, who was brought in as a road musician for the Beach Boys, by Bruce. He always says Daryl and Dennis are the two opposite. They should have never been friends, but they were. And Daryl was such a great musician, and he helped Dennis to start fleshing out some more compositions that were being slated for a solo album at that time in 1970. There was some stuff there was almost, that's 6 years before actually Pacific Ocean Blue came out, but they were thinking about doing it. And there was one single, I think, released from that collaboration that was only released in the UK, and that's a song called Sound of Free. So he had, that's kind of funny to think about that Dennis Wilson was already, just after a couple years of writing tunes, thinking about getting out there and doing a solo thing separate from the Beach Boys. He was the first one to even consider it.
Yeah.
But, didn't at that time. And he was able to, on Sunflower, we've talked about how that's your favorent record.
Yep. Still holds the title for me.
It's a lot of people are getting into that now. And then he had 3 or 4 of the best tunes on there.
Yeah.
And so really blossoming. And
remind me, it's the first
Slip On Through.
That's his.
And he also Got to Know the Woman, but Forever.
Yeah.
And then he helped with It's About Time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's going on. He also, I think it's 1970 when he meets his second wife, Barbara.
Okay.
And 2 sons, Michael and Carl, with her. Think about that. He named his son Michael.
Yeah.
You know who he named him after, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and Carl for yeah. So very interesting there. I've seen wonderful interviews with her. She's, I think she's in the Endless Harmony documentary that Alan did. And I always love listening to her talk about Dennis. She talks about it later long after she was divorced from him, when she said, when I'd see him, it's almost like he'd already died. His body, he had, his body was, but he's already dead.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
Because he just, we'll get into the deterioration starting in the late 70s, but it was pretty nasty, what all ended up going down. But also in 1970 was when he made the movie with James Taylor, Two Lane Blacktop.
Uh-huh.
So that was, man, he had a bunch of stuff going on.
Yeah, busy guy.
Yep. And the mid 70s saw him and Carl wanting to keep in the vein that they'd started with Jack Riley on, Sunflower. Well, the Jack Riley wasn't in on Sunflower, but, keeping that music going that they, all that beautiful music that was on Sunflower and Surf's Up and Carl and the Passion and Holland, they wanted that direction. Whereas after Endless Summer, Mike and Al to some extent at that point too, they said, hey, we want to go back, the audience wants to hear the hits. And
right.
So all of a sudden so that's a big break for the Wilson brothers, and where they, it's kind of like the Beach Boys probably weren't ever what they wanted it to be after that point. And I think about the frustration that might have caused for their progressive mindset.
Well, and that's why when Love You comes out, that's why everyone says it's kind of the end, like the last.
Yeah. A lot of people think that's the last one of the, although there's arguments to be even made past Dennis's death, that the album they made in 85.
Okay.
So.
But it's just something I have actually seen just,
Oh, yeah.
In my, short time researching the Beach Boys and stuff like that I've actually seen people have made that comment about.
Well, they've made that. I had somebody email us that they said, are you guys going to go past Love You? Like they know that's kind of a high watermark, or whatever like that. And then, so yeah, definitely we're at that point. The other thing though, I don't know if it's 75 or 76 that he obtained this Japanese sailing vessel. It's a huge sailboat.
Uh-huh.
And I was watching a little bit of that BBC documentary, and Ed Roach, his buddy, was talking about it. And he said in today's money, that thing would have been, $750,000, maybe even $1 million. It was what they paid for it was a lot back then, but it would be a lot today, because it was a really special boat made hundreds of years ago, and Dennis completely refurbished it all by himself. He took on all the chores, he sanded everything, and he would run, like he knew how to sail that thing and would sail it to, I think they sometimes as far as the Hawaii or something like that, at least to like the Catalina Islands that are off the coast down there. So he could sail a sailboat.
Yeah, well, he seems like one of those guys that might be, working on cars and do that sort of like, that might be like kind of therapy to someone like that, They like to get that's their thing that they do, or like people who like to woodwork, it's like how they get in their own little kind of their world when they're doing that sort of stuff. He kind of seems like if he's a car guy, it reminds me of people that I've met that are like that it's kind of like their zen place, their happy place.
Right. Well, and on the boat, he had a little keyboard and a drum set up, but this is about the time that him and Carl had the studio built in Santa Monica, so they moved all the stuff from Bryant's house down to there and had that set up. Well, that was only a couple miles from where he had the boat docked a lot of time, and so he'd just jump off the boat and run up to the studio and lay stuff down, and I hear a lot so it was really conducive to his creativity at that. That was the time he was making Pacific Ocean Blue. And then, after that, he started working on the Bamboo project too. But I think having the harmony and also the access to him and Carl's brother's studio, whenever he wanted it. I mean, he could get an engineer to meet him in the middle of the night down there. In the end of the 70s, when that studio goes away and his boat goes away because he can't make the payments anymore, that's when Bamboo falls apart, because he loses his whole kind of infrastructure. And then it's, the substance abuse, both, and the alcoholism especially gets real bad around this time and doesn't get any better.
Yeah.
He also had his, share of just unfortunate situations with a lot of friends where the friends basically had to abandon, because they couldn't help him. Because he was just too far gone on a lot of that stuff. I guess we should wait to talk about that till the end, but it's starting to happen at this point. And like in the late 70s, before the real late 70s, like maybe
like 77.
That's 76. 77, 70, Dennis was still a huge draw for those concerts.
Yeah.
Like the sex symbol thing was still going on, and a big part of the shows was that he would come out and do You Are So Beautiful, which had been a massive hit for Joe Cocker in the 70s. And but people don't realize that there's several witnesses were there the night Billy Preston wrote that song, and guess who was sitting there writing that song or contributing lyrics was Dennis.
Oh, really?
And so when that song came out, Dennis owned a little bit, and that's why he went out and sang it at Beach Boy concerts, is because he felt like he had a hand in the writing of it and was just uncredited.
Wow.
Billy Hinchy says that, and there's a couple other people that say, yeah, I saw it happen.
Really?
Yeah. So that's kind of a cool thing about that time period. Also, talking just a little bit more about Pacific Ocean Blue and the music that's on Bamboo. It was never officially released. This is a package that came out, just a few years ago, that Garcia, I think, got it all together. It's just all the stuff from that, and I don't know. A lot of it's finished. All of that music on Pacific Ocean Blue and Bamboo, it's Dennis his writing is so primitive feeling and soulful, just like right to the roots of things. It's like he really was not a schooled musician at all. His chord progression, he doesn't really, there's aren't really chord progressions so much as, his choice of chords is way different, and his writing style is different than Brian's, because Brian was a more educated musician. And so, Dennis does some things that are just way, like, from a music theory standpoint, some of it makes zero sense whatsoever, because it's just, organically. He just did whatever he wanted to do, but it's still on a level it always works somehow, you know. But I did want to say something about how different his writing style was, and how, I guess more than anything, I didn't want to say primitive in a simple sense, but it's just right down to just feels like it cuts to the heart every time, you know. There's no bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, he gets right to the point.
No, I'm glad you clarified that, because primitive, when you first said that, kind of felt, you know, simple, but no, you're saying it's just direct.
Right. And also during this time is when he married Karen Lamb, who was previously married to a member of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And
yes, I remember.
Right, and he married her twice during the Pacific Ocean Blue, that period generally, right? So she was wife number 3 and 4.
3 and 4.
But when we're getting into Bamboo, just not too long after that, he started dating Christine McVie of Fleetwood Mac. And she became a significant part of his life and music life. The Beach Boys and Fleetwood Mac were doing some work together. As a matter of fact, Fleetwood Mac was thinking about buying the studio from Dennis and Carl, because they really liked it. Lindsey Buckingham loved it. And but they were pretty tight, besides Dennis now dating her. And she, we talked about the last episode that she is on Love Surrounds Me on the LA Light album.
Yeah.
And they played a lot of music together, but their relationship, like every other one he had with anybody, was tumultuous and all over the map. It was either, you know, it was fire and ice, man.
Yeah.
And I don't think he ever had one that was just a smooth,
just stable.
And I wonder how much. Let's see, what was the common denominator in all those?
Yeah, that's true.
But anyway, when he lost. So I mentioned before that they lost Brother Studio. They didn't really. It wasn't financially that great of a deal, and so I think Carl wanted to get rid of it before Dennis did, and I think Dennis even tried to look into buying it himself, but he was already doing, because been fired from the Beach Boys. You know, there are several reasons why his income wasn't what it was, including overspending, right? You know, but he failed. You know, quit making the payments on the boat. It got repossessed. Pretty soon, he was homeless. You know. And Dennis Wilson, you know, and begging for money from everybody, including and even from Audrey, and Audrey turning him down. Really? At times.
And what year was this?
No, this is later, probably, you know, the early 80s.
Oh, okay.
You know, getting Brian into trouble some of those times, like going and picking him up and giving him a bunch of cocaine. Well, you'd show up with a bunch of cocaine and a bag of hamburgers. That's how he knew he could get Brian interested in doing something. You know what I mean? As it really did spiral there. He and Brian made some great, there's some documented stuff that they did in the studio in like 82, but they're both just coked out of their heads, and you know, it's just all just studio footage that Brian has used snippets and other things since then, but they were still making good music no matter how messed up they were. Also, you can even tell, like in the video, that they're all. There's no video. This is all just audio, and you can hear. That they're all. I mean, they're amped. Yeah, and they're
it's obvious, huh?
Yeah. That's called the cocaine sessions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's but in the late 70s, people started to notice. Well, with Pacific Ocean Blue, you notice that Dennis's voice starts to even get more rough and edgy. That's mainly from the alcohol and cocaine abuse, but he also smoked. Mm-hmm. And it just got worse and worse and worse. By the late 70s, it was pretty bad. You know, his You Are So Beautiful, all you have to do is look at it in 76, 77, 78, and his voice starts to deteriorate so much. And by the early 80s, the year that he died, especially if you look up July 4th, 1983, they were doing a 4th of July concert in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And he just gets up there he can he has so many polyps on his vocal cords and stuff that he can barely just kind of rasp out just one line of "You are so beautiful," and he does that and "Thank you, the Beach Boys." But he lost his voice was just destroyed.
Wow. So he actually had like
yeah. And I think he underwent some surgery to get some in. I think Christine McVie might have had to pay the bill on one of those deals. I don't know what. But I know that,
Jeez.
yeah, I mean, it just was a
Sad deal,
downward
yeah,
spiral.
sad deal.
And then we mentioned this, wife number 5,
Yeah.
who was 19 years old at the time. And of course, we've talked about, Dennis was 39,
Okay.
or, right there. So, but she came around with with Dennis's daughter. I think she was a friend of Jennifer, his first real child. And I think he even knew before he started seeing her that this was the child that Mike Love had fathered out of wedlock in 1965.
Oh.
I think that he had a paternity suit that was against him. Anyway, it's pretty well documented, and everybody in the Wilson camp pretty much knew that. I think Mike still denies it. But you basically marrying your first cousin's daughter, and then they had a child together.
Yeah. Wow.
That was Dennis's last kid. Is Gage is his name. I don't know if it's Murray Gage or Gage Murray, but Gage was one of Murray's names. So again, here comes Murray back. That weird situation we talk about, how the double side, the two sides of the coin that the Wilson brothers had, that relationship with their dad.
Right.
That was bad, but they couldn't give up the love part of it.
Yeah.
Even up till the very end, we're doing things to honor him,
sure,
or something like that. But that's
crazy
situation.
That is a wild, normal circumstances would fall under dysfunctional. That's but you're talking about this rock star family here, and it's just that's something else.
Yeah, I knew that you kind of didn't know that part of it.
And I know that you don't like to focus on. That's not what you're about. You're about the music, and and you don't focus on that too much. So this will probably be the first and last time you'll even bring it up.
Well, and I like, I just look at interviews with Mike since Dennis's death, and I see love and reverence even in spite of all that crap, so who, of course I hate to put that stuff out there, but it's part of the story.
Yeah.
And we're telling a story here. Yeah. So you've got Dennis and Sean, which, believe it or not, their marriage was rocky.
Yeah.
Who
would have thought?
Yeah. And so they spent the last basically 6 months of their life. They were staying in the Santa Monica Bay Inn right there in Santa Monica. It was right across the street from Dennis's favorite bar, Shay J's, where he would just in the morning just head over there, start drinking. This was all through the 80s. He was every day pretty much would get a bottle of orange juice, pour half of it out, fill the other half with either rum or vodka, and start in. And his buddies were saying they would witness him do things like opening the mail in the morning, and it would shaking pretty violently. And just all the hallmarks. And unfortunately, I know that stuff too.
Yeah.
Too well with my alcoholism, and it's just a sad story to hear. It's the opening the mail thing. I think it's Ed Roach tells the story about the Beach Boys had played for President Reagan and Vice President Bush at the time, or something like that, and they were going through the mail, and there was a piece of mail that had George Bush return address on it. It was a letter to Dennis, and he had written one to every one of the Beach Boys, but it said, "Thank you for coming and doing this. If there's anything I can ever do for you, you just let me know." And Dennis said, Dennis looked at him and he goes, "I'm gonna make that son of a bitch pay for that one." But what happened when Dennis died, they were given special permission that is hardly ever granted to bury him at sea.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so that's, kind of, and that was the Reagan administration was going, and so I think they actually gave the permission.
Wow.
For, so it's a bit. Let's go ahead and talk about the end of Dennis's life, and he was having that relationship with Sean that was on and off again and again, just really tumultuous. But he had been recently in rehab. They'd put him in there. This is in December of '83, and they were hoping that he was in really bad shape. I think it was St. John's Hospital or something like that. And he was only there about 3 days, and he busted out and did some really crazy stuff. Took a baseball bat to a BMW that was one of the guys he thought Sean was seeing, and it's all kinds of, just, he ended up at a friend's boat where he used to have the Harmony in Marina del Rey.
Uh-huh.
So he was in, the friend's boat was right beside where he used to have the Harmony, and Dennis had been drinking like he probably had the last year,
uh-huh.
You know what I mean? Had a lot of alcohol in him. He started diving off this guy's boat to go down, and he found stuff. He was bringing stuff up that he had thrown off the Harmony, like a picture of him and Karen came up with a and he was going down to, finding this stuff and bringing it up. But while everybody else was getting nervous, say, "Hey, Dennis, that water's a little cold." And they knew how much he'd been drinking. And, "Oh, I'm fine." They don't, David Marks tells the story of, I don't know if he has inside information on the autopsy, but it makes a lot of sense that what's hypothesized is not necessarily getting drunk and drowning, but when he was coming up, he hit a piling on his head and it knocked him out.
Oh.
And when they found his body, it wasn't like a normal drowning victim. They found him down like down at the bottom, curled up.
Interesting.
That's just kind of interesting.
Huh.
So that's and Brian saw it on the news. Or I think maybe he heard about it from the Beach Boys management, but that night, he says that, saw him in the body bag with one arm, because it was on the news, them taking it. It's really sad. That was, you got to look at that point of, Dennis was the real Beach Boy. That's, the Beach Boys didn't die, and they had a press conference shortly after where they said Dennis would want us to go on, and they did, but it certainly wasn't the same. And man, I remember I saw it on People magazine at a grocery store. Dennis Wilson dies at 39 years old. I remember it was the 7th grade or something like that. And I remember going, whoa. And I didn't put it together at that time, but I'm so lucky. You're thinking that in 79 and 80, I'd seen them all. Right. With Dennis, So, that's, he was an amazing part of that whole thing. And a certain part of them did die, and it was never the same. Much the same when after Till I Die in 71, it was never the same after that. And it was different until Love You, but after Love You, and then when Dennis dies, and then you get on to Carl, it was always a different thing.
A shift in the story. But
the losing Dennis, because he was so much, as one Jerry Schilling, the manager, he said he was so much the balls of the group.
Yeah.
He was really,
well put.
Great musician, one of the greatest examples of organic musicianship. Of course, I always say that about all the Wilson brothers. But Dennis is probably the most amazing of that story, and what he was able to do with his music and contribute to what the Beach Boys were. Yeah,
and it's moving forward for the little history that we have left. It's going to be interesting to not have these random, Dennis moments that we're like, at this point Dennis did this, or it definitely shifts the dynamic of the story. And but like you said, we had to got to acknowledge each Beach Boy,
mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think that pretty much wasn't his life in a nutshell right there.
Well, I don't know if it was or not. I hope we got the important
For me,
things in there. Yeah.
Hey, when we started, it was like, if nothing else, you're going to teach me. So bring the listeners along for the ride. So
Yeah.
we will do a Mike episode at some point.
Yeah, towards a few more episodes of the history, and then a Mike one right before the end of the season, I think.
Okay. Well, if that'll do it for this episode, then thank you for listening. I know it's happy 4th of July. When this airs, it'll have just been 4th of July. So happy 4th, and we will see you in the next episode when we will be going over what's our years.
Oh man, don't ask me right now, but it might be 80 to like 88 after Brian's first solo record and Kokomo.
Okay,
kind of go up through that period. So.
But don't hold him to that. You never know.
Don't do that at all.
You never know. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.